What's up, everybody? I hope you're doing well. Welcome to the extended cut, minimally edited podcast version of this week's episode. Now, I know that all of my podcasts are quite chatty, but I think this week's episode is going to be particularly chatty. I have plans to kind of double up on filming some of my episodes because the month of October is just full of fun stuff, and I would like to work a little less next month. So you might be seeing some more of these kind of chit-chatty style episodes coming out over the coming weeks. And this episode is no exception. Lately, I've been reflecting a lot on just how hard it is to become a therapist and how it only seems to be getting harder for the current generation of therapist trainees. And I like to kind of do a thought experiment where I think about, like, if I were becoming a therapist today, what I might do differently than back when I did trained to become a therapist. So today I thought I would share some of those thoughts with you. And honestly, most of these changes aren't necessarily because everything is so different today compared to, 15 years ago when I started graduate school, but also just wisdoms I think that I've gathered over the years that even if I could go back to 15 years ago would have been really helpful if I applied them back then. And of course, anything I ever share with you and put out there is just my opinion. And this in particular is me reflecting on my own personal, very specific situation. So please don't hear whatever I have to share in this episode as advice for what you should do. I actually feel quite opposite of that. However, as I look back, most of the things that I would change if I could go back go against the grain of whatever I was advised to do at the time. So I'm just wanting to put this narrative out there so that, you're aware that you have options when it comes to training as a therapist as well. And just to be clear, in case you haven't heard me say it along the way, I absolutely love being a therapist. I hope I can do this forever. As long as my mind and my body are able to keep offering therapy, I will do it. I love this career path so much. And I think I took myself on a little bit of a bumpier ride than was necessary in order to get here. I think this is a less common thing, but for me, I knew since I was 14 that I wanted to be a therapist. There was no looking back all the way from then. So I have no regrets, and I'm so glad that I'm here. And I think as we look back, you'll notice that some of the things that I'd go back and tweak about my career path are just related to how young I was when I started embarking on this path, and naive, and also just kind of more blindly taking the advice of people around me because I thought they knew better. And now I'm a little older and I'm like, just because someone's older than you, it doesn't mean that they know better. They might know better about a lot of things, but whatever advice they would give their past selves might not be the best advice for you, even though you might be 19 or however old I was at the time. As I'm attempting to channel younger Marie and trying to remember where I was at the time when I was just first entering my training years to become a therapist, I think I had some wherewithal that whatever I was thinking was the right career path for me at 18, 19, and 20 had the potential to change over the trajectory of my career. So one general approach I remember taking at the time was to try to keep as many career options available to myself as possible. So if there was any path towards becoming a therapist that left the door open to a lot of other options, I was going to take it. Of course, hindsight is 2020. I know where I'm at now, and I didn't know back then where I'd be at by now, but I didn't need to have all those doors open, and it definitely cost me something. So I think as we run through these things that I would change, you're going to see those two items pop up thematically. One, that I just was trying to keep as many doors open as humanly possible. And I also gave other people's advice, I think, too much weight in my decision making because I just assumed that they knew what was best. One of those influences that came up quite a bit now in retrospect is because I attended an academic institution in undergrad, I had a lot of forces, professors, grad students that I worked with that were really steering me in an academic direction. Now, it's been 20 years since I started undergrad. That feels a little painful to acknowledge. And I sure hope this is different now, at least a little bit, than it was then. But because I went to an academic institution, all of my professors at that time had had no clinical hands-on therapeutic experience for all of my clinical psychology courses. And there was a huge push towards doing research And unfortunately, I had multiple professors steer me away from becoming a therapist. It kind of blows my mind to remember specific memories of what professors told me. Like, I remember this one professor that I worked with pretty extensively for multiple quarters as both a TA and a research assistant, maybe for 2 years working with him. I was telling him what I wanted to do and that I wanted to be a therapist. And I remember him saying something along the lines of, wait, you want to be a therapist? But you're so smart, Marie. You could be a researcher. Don't you want to be a researcher? Why would you throw your life away like that? Now, if somebody in a position of authority said something like this to me today, first of all, I'd politely call them out on it in the moment. Like, you don't speak to people that way. Also, I would swiftly exit that relationship as soon as was achievable and reasonable. At the time, though, I was probably about 20 years old, and I thought he knew better. I thought maybe he was right. So one of the ways that I tried to keep every single door open as possible was I kept the research path as wide open as I possibly could, even though, as far as I could tell at the time, I had no interest in becoming a researcher. It's not because I don't like research, I just don't like doing the research. I appreciate that other people do the research. I want to use the research and apply it directly with folks that I work with in therapy. So one of the ways that played out is, as an undergrad, the psych majors at my school at the time had the option of pursuing either a Bachelor of Arts degree or a Bachelor of Science degree in psychology. And so I decided to get the Bachelor of Science degree because I thought that was going to give me a leg up in keeping the door open for becoming a researcher, even though I didn't want to be a researcher. I wanted to be a therapist. And as it turns out, the BS degree was far more rigorous than the BA degree for psychology at the time. Primarily, I had to do the hard math, like the one that the engineers do. And yeah, that math was not related at all to the advanced statistics that I would be doing later in graduate school. I don't know why they make you do that math, to be honest. I think it's just to be like, you earned it, it's science, STEM. Oh gosh, I have feelings. We don't need to trail off on that right now. And another variable that I remember being quite different about getting the BS degree is I needed to do quite a bit of research, like quite a bit of research. I think something like 10 hours a week for the last couple years. I don't remember how much of that was the required amount or if I was a goody two-shoes and I did the required amount plus extra. But it was a lot of research. I think you can gather by now from the way I've been talking about things that BS degree had pretty much no benefit to my career trajectory. It just cost me a whole bunch of stress and time. And let me be clear, I think participating in research is highly valuable for anyone who wants to pursue a career in psychology of any form. It was just very extensive, the amount of research that I ended up doing. And also, it was so unrelated to my future career path of being a therapist. I guess you could say, if anything, one benefit of doing all that research is it did highlight for me how much that was not my future career path. The example of this that's just absolutely burned into my memory is one of my research assistantships, whatever they call it, was at the local veterans hospital, and the research I was participating in conducting was related to interviewing veterans about their stress levels, which, as you can imagine, veterans unfortunately have a lot of stressors in their history and also often in their current history as well. And something that was really, really difficult for me in that research study is I was interviewing this very vulnerable population with an extensive history of trauma about their life stressors, and I wasn't able to do anything about that for them. I'm literally collecting information from them and thanking them and saying goodbye. And there is no therapy because that's not what it was. It was research. It's very valuable to have that information for research purposes. However, for me, it was so incredibly painful to feel like I was just sitting on my hands asking people to share their darkest, most challenging moments and not being in a position to support them in any way at all. But anyway, suffice it to say, if I could go back, I would have gotten a Bachelor of Arts degree instead of a Bachelor of Science degree. Another way that I tried to keep all the doors open was I planned to get a doctorate degree. Some of that might have also been through professor influence as well. I was interacting a lot with my professors in undergrad undergrad, all of whom had doctorate degrees because, again, at least at the time, at the academic institution I was a part of, all the professors had to have a doctorate level degree. I even had a professor lose her job because she had a PsyD instead of a PhD. I know as the words are coming out of my mouth, I feel upset saying them, and I was upset at the time that it happened as well. I don't agree with any of that at the moment, but that was certainly the case at the time. I hope it's different now, but something tells me it's probably not. Even though it would have made sense to get a PhD from these two driving factors of following the advice of my professors and trying to keep as many potential career doors open as possible, I did work pretty closely with one of the PhD students in the clinical psychology program that was at UCSD at the time. And I remember seeing her schedule one day and noticing that there were only 3 therapy clients on her schedule. And I asked her if that was typical, and she said yes. And I remembered thinking, I would like to see more than 3 therapy clients a week when I'm going through rigorous training to be a therapist. Like, to me, 3 therapy clients a week over a couple of years of your graduate training is nowhere near sufficient to be adept at being a therapist. So between that and also really loving that one professor that unfortunately got let go because she had a PsyD instead of a PhD, I know, again, very upsetting. I felt like the PsyD was the right fit for me because it would have very rigorous clinical training, and it would keep the door open for so many other things that a doctorate degree opens, I thought, would open the door for, whether it be research, assessment, or, certain types of teaching roles, that I would keep the doors open for all of those with my doctorate degree, but getting the clinical training that I really wanted. Sidebar on that I was not educated about as an undergrad, but if you're looking into this, you should definitely educate yourself about, is if you get a PhD in psychology versus a PsyD in psychology, there is a vast difference in the average debt between those 2 degrees. So that's also a variable you might like to consider. The downside is when you get a PhD, part of the reason why you don't accrue so much debt is because you are signing on to research under somebody else's grant, and that may or may not be research that you're interested in doing. So trade-offs. Now, one thing I definitely did know about myself that I wanted to keep the door open for is I knew for sure that I would want to teach someday in some capacity. I was right about that. That stayed constant. I definitely love teaching. It just so happens that I'm doing it right now primarily through a YouTube channel and online courses, and that was just not something I had even fathomed when I was an undergrad. YouTube didn't even exist yet, or podcasts. So I just assumed it would be through a more traditional means. And again, I went to a university that only hired professors with doctorate level degrees, again, unfortunately. And so I presumed that if I ever wanted to teach, I would also need a doctorate degree. Also, let me be clear, you don't need a doctorate level degree if you want to teach someday. Do some institutions require you to have a doctorate level degree? Yes. But I would also argue if your primary hope is to teach rather than do research, that there's a lot of places where you can just teach and not do research. And at an academic institution, you would primarily be doing research and teaching on the side. That just generally seems to be the case for the most part. Maybe there's some exceptions, but academic institutions tend to hire only research-based doctorate level folks, and less academically focused institutions might be more open to hiring a professor who, get this, is there because they want to be a professor and teach. I think if I'd done a little bit more research about graduate degrees outside of my professors at my academic institution, I might have been able to pinpoint this a bit sooner before applying to graduate school. And if I could go back, I definitely would have chosen a master's level degree instead of a doctorate level degree. Not because I think master's level degrees are better than doctorate degrees. I think it just makes sense to get the degree that fits the career path that you want to take. And the career path that I've chosen does not at all merit a doctorate level degree. A master's level degree is more than sufficient to do everything that I'm doing now. I don't know which of the many now counseling related master's level degrees I would have gone for. I haven't done that research because I'm already here now, but I'm sure that one of those master's level routes would have been a better fit for me. It would have saved me a lot of time, certainly a lot of money, and also just like energy put it into learning things that were just really unnecessary for my future career path. Like I wrote a whole dissertation. Can you just like let that sink in for a little bit? Like I wrote a whole dissertation knowing that I would be done doing research after I finished my dissertation. Like the hundreds of hours I put into that thing. I don't know how that sits. I guess if you've ever done a dissertation, then you know, I guess. I don't know. It's like hundreds of hours on top of my full-time pre-doctoral internship, which yes, I was not paid for that either. And I paid my school tuition to get school credits for that. So I'm accruing debt to spend 40 hours a week working for somebody else and pulling all-nighters to write an entire dissertation. Like it's just, anyway, I could have skipped it. Like that was just a lot of time spent on a dissertation. That was a lot of time spent. And I learned how to do learning how to do assessments. So much time spent. I knew I wasn't going to be doing assessments. I knew it, but I learned it. Just sitting with the regret of all the time I wasted. But if you want to do research, if you want to do assessments, all of that, then a doctorate degree might actually be a great fit for you. So please don't hear this as me bashing the doctorate degree. And I'll say this too, one way I felt like I justified my doctorate level degree at the time was that I did have so much rigorous clinical therapy training. Like I do remember when I first finished my doctorate degree and I was entering that postdoc phase, when I was working alongside master's level graduates, I realized like at that point I'd had almost 5,000 hours of clinical training. And some of the folks that I was working with master's level degrees had maybe 500 hours of clinical training and sometimes less. So I remember at the time I felt super grateful because I was like, I'm like a full-blown equipped therapist. But here's the thing. I had to be forking out so much tuition in order to get that clinical training. And now my mindset's different. If I were going into it today, if there was a route where I could minimize how much time I was in graduate school forking out tuition, but then focus a lot of my training efforts after graduating, I would definitely choose that path over being fully trained on every level at the expense of paying a lot more tuition to be in school for longer. If I'm being idealistic, we should get all of our training in graduate school. However, if you can sort of play your cards right, you might be able to spend less time in graduate school, spend less money on tuition, and then supplement your training as much as you want after you've graduated, when hopefully you're getting paid for the work that you're doing rather than paying your school money for the work that you're doing. And getting supervision, getting all the training that you need without getting more debt. I know I've already been jibber-jabbering for a while, and all I've really said is I would have gotten a BA degree instead of a BS degree, and I would have gotten a master's level degree instead of a doctorate level degree, but I felt like all of that backstory was worth acknowledging. But I'm not done sharing all the things I'd go back to change, and the next thing I would change, I think, is just a little bit more countercultural than some of the stuff I've shared so far. And before we get into those, I'd like to thank Powbox for sponsoring today's episode. HIPAA compliance is always top of mind for me, so I was completely surprised when I learned that Google Workspace and Microsoft 365 alone are not enough to be HIPAA compliant, even if you have a signed BAA with them. I know. That's why a little over a year ago, I started using Powbox, which is the simplest, most effective solution for mental health professionals to seamlessly integrate HIPAA security into your email, all while using your favorite email provider. I genuinely was surprised by how easy it was to set up. In about 10 minutes, I had Powbox set up and fully integrated with my Google Workspace, and I haven't had to touch it once since then. But I can rest assured knowing it's keeping all my clients' correspondence with me secure without having to log into a portal to communicate with with them. If you'd like to give Powbox a try, they're running a great offer right now where the first 100 people who say my name at sign up get $250 off their first year. To get the deal, just head to powbox.com and mention Marie Fang at sign up. That's Powbox spelled Paubox.com. Well, thank you again to Powbox for sponsoring today's episode. And now back to the next thing I would change if I could do my training over again. Now, in my mind, the next change on this list feels really countercultural to me, but now I'm thinking about it and I'm wondering if the culture has changed since I was in graduate school. So you can let me know in the comments if this is not countercultural anymore. I would actually love that if that were true, but it felt countercultural to me to put it on the list because I didn't really see it happening very much at the time. Anyway, enough rambling. The next thing I would do differently is I would do my grad program part-time. I know. Back when I was in graduate school, did anyone in my grad program do it part-time? If it was happening, it wasn't the route that I saw most people taking. To me, and I think maybe to a lot of people around me, it sort of felt like a rip the Band-Aid off kind of situation. Like, this is going to be hard. We're going to be pinching pennies. It's going to be rigorous. So let's make this as short of a part of my life as possible. I mean, especially getting a doctorate level degree. It was a 4-year program. A lot of people spent 5 or 6 years on the program. So if you go half time, now you're looking at something like 10 years of your life dedicated just to graduate school. And that just feels painful. But if I was doing, let's say, a 2-year master's level program and doing that one half time, well, that might have taken me 4 years to finish, and that's how long I spent in school anyway. Now, for me, there's 2 reasons why I would want to do grad school part-time if I were doing it today. One is that you can just really absorb the material in a way that's much more effective. You can actually have some time in your schedule to do your own personal reflections that your professors always tell you to do. And then you go with, what time, professor? When am I going to do this personal growth that you speak of? Because I'm busy writing your 20-page paper that you have me do every week. Are there some residual feelings in my heart? Yes. I know this isn't the right thing to say, but I think the only way that I was able to be successful, on paper at least, in graduate school was I had to cut corners, and I was just strategic about knowing which corners were okay to cut. So yes, if a professor assigned 300 pages of reading in just one class for that 1 week, I'm not going to be reading those 300 pages, and the cost is going to be like, now when we enter our discussion group for the next lecture, it's maybe going to come across that I only skimmed it and I might get a little bit of a scolding, but I'd rather do that but still get my paper in and still get the grade, or still show up for my practicum clients and make sure I'm offering the best care that I can give them, getting supervision about that. And yeah, if I didn't read 300 pages that week, you got to do what you got to do, right? So I definitely cut every corner that I felt was reasonable to be cut. If there was a personal reflection paper, which felt like I was writing one for some class almost every week. Some classes you had to write a paper every single week that was some sort of multiple page personal reflection. I intentionally chose personal reflections about things that were only moderately deep. If I tried to go there and share my deepest things, it would take me so long and drain all my energy, and that work is so valuable, but I didn't have the time to do that. How the heck was I supposed to do that for every single class, going to school full time with like a shortage of almost every resource? It just wasn't available to me. So that was strategic on my part, and I think was me making the best of the situation as I could, given that I did do my program full time. So if I did do my program part time, I really could have invested. Like, I could have actually done the stuff. I could have read the 300 pages. I could have gone all in on my personal reflection papers and like made it this really meaningful therapeutic experience for me. And that would have been really wonderful to have that. And not to mention like absorbing all the training. I mean, it would have trickled down to every level. Like, I would have been just more emotionally available for my therapy clients, which when you're a practicum student right at the beginning, like, A single therapy hour takes so much effort and energy, so much prep work. You're so tired after. And so a therapy hour as a trainee is not created equal to like a therapy hour 10 years after licensure. Like that's just, that's how learning new skills works. It's harder in the beginning. So I would have loved to have the time to really kind of tend to all of those things. And the other reason why I'd want to go part-time is so that I could spend the other part of my time working. What happened for me doing my program full-time is I had to still work in order to make ends meet, and I cobbled together a whole bunch of side jobs just to make a little extra income. And depending on the week, I'd work anywhere from an extra 10 to 30 hours doing like side gigs just to kind of make all the ends meet. And by side gigs, I'm talking about things that were flexible enough that I could kind of just squeeze them in here and there where I could. I was a nanny, I was a research assistant, I was a TA, I was a dog walker, I had an Etsy store. I just cobbled these things together that generally didn't have a particularly high pay, like only a little bit above minimum wage generally. And I think if I had done school part-time, it could have been reasonable for me to, say, work half-time at a more reasonable wage or even potentially full-time because I was already working so much anyway and just squeezing those hours into the cracks of my full-time school. So personally, maybe it might have been possible for me to have a more stable full-time job and take night classes part-time. And yeah, the primary motivator for this is to just make the financial burden of going to graduate school a little bit more tolerable. So I said at the beginning of this episode that as an undergrad, the general approach that I took was to keep as many doors open as possible and to follow the advice of my professors. And now what I would change is my general approach would emphasize more on how do I maintain as much sanity as possible while I do this incredibly challenging thing, and anything I can do to make that a little bit financially smoother, a little bit emotionally smoother, I'm going to take that opportunity. And part of that switch is looking at graduate school as a necessary hoop to jump through in order to then be able to access as many trainings as I need to be a proficient, qualified therapist, rather than seeing graduate school as the end-all be-all place for me to get all my graduate level training. Because graduate school is way more expensive than any other path pretty much to get training. Even though training is really expensive, it's still cheaper than graduate school. If you want to get some highly specialized training or special supervision, still cheaper than grad school. So that's something to kind of keep in perspective. If there's any way to shrink the cost of grad school, shrink how long you're in graduate school, and just be open to pushing some of that training after graduate school, I think for me at least, that approach would make a lot more sense if I were doing this today. It seems important to acknowledge that that approach only makes sense because of where I've ended up in my career. And so the advice here that I would give myself may not actually be the best advice for everyone else or even the average person. There are some very highly specialized paths that require you to follow certain steps to get to where you want to go. But because I've chosen this career path that doesn't require a very specific type of graduate level training, it just requires, the degree and the license, then the route that I take to get here, it could be any number of routes that I could get here and do the same work that I'm doing now and be just as qualified as I am now, but it could have been much smoother and less expensive and less stressful. Those are some of the changes that I would make, I guess. Well, I hope this was helpful for you to listen to. Part of why I wanted to record this is just because, to me, it can almost feel surprising how drastically different my approach would be now, almost 20 years later, than where I was at back then. And I'm just wondering if it's helpful for some people to hear that if you are earlier in your journey, whether you're young like I was at the time, or you could be any age, but maybe just starting to think about embarking in your training to become a therapist. I just want you to know that there's lots of potential ways to approach it, and it's more important to think about what your needs are, what your end goals are, and which available path to get there makes the most sense for you and your values and your goals. That's all. Pretty simple, right? Well, thank you so much for joining me in this episode. You might be seeing some more of these kind of chit chat style episodes in the next month or two, just because I got a lot of stuff on my schedule. So I'm going to let myself focus on those a little bit and make my video making process a little smoother. But I hope you still found this supportive wherever you are in your career journey. And until next time, from one therapist to another, I wish you well.